So my husband, Rowie, is an avid reader, and he really likes the sound of my voice. So this weekend, he turns to me and he says, for the first time, "Do you want to read the book to me out loud?" And luckily for him, he was reading my favorite introduction to Musar book, Everyday Holiness by Alan Marinis. So he knew that I would say yes. And I promised Cantor Sanasur that I would admit that as cheesy as it is, I highly recommend that. We've now been reading to each other out loud. So anyway, the last chapter that we read was about gratitude. And it felt as if the book really jumped off the page and spoke to us directly. When you open yourself to experience the trait of gratitude, Marinis writes, you discover with clarity how much good there is in your life. Rowie and I exchanged glances and almost telepathically agreed, well, during a time like this one, it is really hard to be grateful. Instantly, in the next sentence, we read, the obstacles to appreciating the good are very real, especially when life is riven by suffering. But, Marinis opined, it is worth the effort to practice gratitude, especially since the one who benefits most is the one who is suffering. The war between Israel and Hamas is far from being over. I imagine many of us here feel like sitting ducks as we watch with helplessness from afar. And we need to find a way to endure, because this will likely be long. And I believe this week's Parshat Vayigash, our Jewish tradition, holds part of the answer. Marinis reminds readers that when Leah, one of Jacob's wives, had her fourth child, she named him Yehudah, which means I am grateful. The name Jew derives from Yehudi, the people of Yehudah, revealing that gratitude is intrinsic to being Jewish. Parshat Vayigash is proof of Judaism's focus on gratitude, even amidst times of turmoil, loss, and pain. From last week's Parsha, we know about Joseph's many trials and tribulations. His brothers envied him, so they almost murdered him, but instead settled on selling their own brother into slavery in a foreign place. Later, Joseph was thrown in jail, only to be released during a famine. I believe everyone would agree that Joseph had reason to suffer. And yet, in the climax of Parshat Vayigash, the moment Joseph finally reveals his identity to his family, he emphasizes 3 times, I am your brother Joseph, who you sold into slavery, but now don't be distressed or reproach yourselves, because you sold me. It was all in order to save life that God sent me ahead of you. In other words, Joseph found a higher purpose in his plight and during the famine, which at this point still had 5 years left to go. That purpose being, Joseph could save lives with his dreams. Poignantly, this parsha begins with the words, Vayigash elav Yehudah. Literally, Yehudah or Judah came to Joseph, but figuratively, gratitude overcame him. Joseph felt as though everything happened for a reason, as though God placed him in places and times of history for the purpose of saving human lives. And in turn, Joseph found love in his heart for his brothers, despite the pain they put him through. Joseph found meaning in his suffering. As Rabbi Dan Moskowitz writes, Joseph learned with time that good can come from, or be made from, challenge, disappointment, and heartache. Or as Rabbi Nachum Ish Gamzu always said in the Talmud, despite his positive or negative circumstances, that Joseph embodied the idiom, Gamzu letovah, and that is also for the good. Rabbi Moskowitz underscores that Joseph's is not the only story from Torah and Jewish history that demonstrates how good can come from or be made from pain. To name a few instances, the sin of Adam and Eve leads to human intelligence. The flood of Noah gives human life a second chance. Abraham leaves his family, his land, and everything he knows to begin our ancestral lineage. The Exodus from Egypt gives rise to the unification of the Jewish people, and the destruction of the Second Temple birthed Rabbinic Judaism, and the Holocaust contributed to the establishment of Israel. Making meaning from suffering is the essential message of Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. Frankl believed, quote, "We give our suffering meaning by the way in which we respond to it." He even went as far as to suggest that suffering ceases to be suffering as soon as it finds meaning. Another Holocaust survivor and psychologist, Dr. Edith Eger, authored a book called The Choice, in which she wrote, "My ballet master once told me, all your ecstasy in life is going to come from the inside. I never understood what he meant," she said, "until Auschwitz." Eger continued, "We can choose what horror teaches us, to become bitter in our grief and fear, hostile, or to hold on to the childlike part of us. We can pay attention to what we've lost, or pay attention to what we still have." Now, it is crucial to understand that this search for the good is not a denial of the pain, nor should trauma be a fact of gratitude. Frankl wrote, "Suffering is not necessary to find meaning, only that meaning is possible in spite of suffering." We certainly do not wish for what has happened in Israel, what is happening, nor do we want the anguish being inflicted upon all innocent life. So the question is, what do we do now? Eger, Frankl, and Jewish tradition encourage us to still find gratitude, even while living in peril, even during the unthinkable, like the Holocaust. Making meaning helps us feel as if the suffering is not in vain, and even more than giving purpose to our pain, the meaning, gratitude, faith, whatever words we choose to symbolize finding good, serves as our seed for hope. And without hope, there is no possibility for the future. As much as we struggle to believe it, or I certainly struggle to believe it, Eger, who can testify personally to this, reminds us, even in hell, hope can flower. Joseph realizes this when he speaks with his brothers. Not only does he find meaning in his suffering, which changes the arc of his life, but he also gives that gift to his entire family. Joseph voices to his brothers that the past is the past, beyond their control, but together they can shape what comes next. This week's Parsha comes to us at a critical juncture. 76 days since one of the most brutal attacks on the Jewish people, followed by continued loss of innocent life, an apparent denial from people around the world about Hamas's threat of danger to both Israelis and Palestinians, a rejection of Israel's attempt to re-engage in ceasefire, and what feels like an undervaluing of the hostages' lives, complete denial of their lives, still deprived of human rights and missing from their families and loved ones. It is incredibly challenging to feel anything positive at a time like this. It is impossible for us to know what comes next, to know if there will be, in fact, an outcome that has any semblance of being so-called good. And to reiterate Viktor Frankl, this suffering is certainly not necessary for us, for anyone, to be able to find reason for meaning and gratitude, nor does it preclude us from the work that must be done to help others. The reality is, however, there will be no future if we cannot find some hope, and even if we cannot find sparks of joy. While writing this, I was acutely aware that many of us are on the verge of vacation, some to Australia and New Zealand, especially families with children following school calendar breaks. We might be planning to go away with friends and family, or we may be staycationing in our homes. Perhaps we're retired, and we've had a great deal of time sitting with our thoughts. It's easy for us to feel shame for being happy, to ask ourselves, well, why do I deserve this trip? Or how is it that I get to sleep with healthy kids under my roof while parents out there are suffering, wondering where their kids are, who has them, and if they'll return safely? Unfortunately, as Rabbi Harold Kushner's book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, echoes in our minds, we cannot know those answers. What we can do is find every reason to be grateful for all that we do have, for our families and our love, for reading aloud back and forth to partners, for the work we may be able to do to support loved ones in Israel and innocent Palestinian lives being lost, for the reality that Israel exists and has an army to defend itself, for the renewed connection between Israeli and American Jews, for the clarity of our priorities, for the realization of true friends, for the reminder of our humanity and the breath we are so lucky to take each and every day. Suffering is not necessary to derive meaning. Pain, however, is inevitable. So I pose these Herculean questions for us to continue pondering. What will we do to keep going? What gratitude will you find? Can you make space for that joy? What good can we create? Shabbat Shalom.